No business being here. She doesn't even have a real job. My father said that about me, in a boardroom, in front of 11 people, including the man who had just offered me a 7-figure acquisition deal for the company I built from scratch. I didn't say a word. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table and let him keep going. That was the worst mistake he ever made. Let me back up. I grew up in Sudbury, in one of those houses where the heat sometimes got cut off in February and nobody talked about it. My father, I'll call him my father because that's the word, even if it stopped meaning anything to me a long time ago, worked in mining administration his whole career. Middle management, respectable. He had a company pension and an opinion about everything and a way of walking into a room like he was the most important person in it, even when he very much wasn't. My mother was quieter. She kept the house, drove us to school, made sure there was food when the money was tight. She passed when I was 19, ovarian cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to gone. I don't talk about that much, but it matters for what comes later. I have one brother, older than me by 4 years. My father's favorite in the way that some fathers have favorites without ever admitting it out loud, the son who got the car for his 17th birthday, the one whose university tuition was paid in full, the one whose phone calls got returned the same day. His name is Theo. He works in commercial real estate and he has excellent hair and very little else going for him, but my father has always looked at him like he hung the moon. I, on the other hand, was the girl who asked too many questions and wanted to do things that didn't make sense to a man who measured success in pension years and parking spots. I wanted to start a company. Not just any company, I wanted to build a property technology firm, PropTech, in the industry shorthand, something that used data analytics and AI-assisted tools to help smaller landlords and property managers compete with the big institutional players that were gobbling up residential real estate across Ontario and BC. I had watched what happened to rental markets in cities like Hamilton and Kelowna. I had watched working families get priced out while algorithmic pricing software pushed rents up in lockstep across entire neighborhoods. I thought there had to be a better tool for the other side of that equation. I was 26 when I started building it. I was working full-time at a tech consultancy in Toronto, freelancing on weekends, living in a one-bedroom in Parkdale that I shared with a roommate and her enormous cat. I had $18,000 in a TFSA and a laptop that overheated if I ran too many tabs. I did not ask my father for money. I want to be very clear about that. I did not ask him. He offered. And the way he offered, the way he framed it, I should have known better than to say yes. He came to Toronto in the spring of 2019. Theo had a real estate conference downtown, and they both came to my apartment for dinner. I made pasta. Theo talked about the conference the whole time. My father sat in my kitchen and looked around at my setup, the second monitor on my desk, the whiteboard I had covered in architecture diagrams, and he asked what I was working on. I told him. I showed him the product roadmap. I showed him the early revenue projections. I showed him letters of interest from 3 property management companies in Mississauga who had said they'd pay for beta access. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, and I remember this exactly, I could put in $50,000 as an investment. Not a gift, an investment. I should have asked what that meant in writing before I said yes. But I was 26 and I was excited and he was my father, and I actually thought that maybe this was the beginning of something different between us. I took the money, I signed nothing. There was no formal agreement, no shareholder documentation, no promissory note, just a wire transfer and a handshake and my father's word. You already know where this is going. I named the company Halcyon Analytics. I know, it's a bit much. I was 26. I incorporated in Ontario in June of 2019, set up properly through a startup lawyer in Toronto, issued shares, the whole thing. I gave myself 80% of the company and reserved 20% for future investors or key hires. I did not give shares to my father. He had not asked for shares. He had said investment, and I had treated it as convertible financing, informal. But that's what it was in my head. That ambiguity was a gift to him later. I didn't see it at the time. The product launched in beta in early 2020, which was, as timing goes, genuinely terrible. March 2020 happened. The world stopped. The property management market went into a kind of suspended confusion. I pivoted hard, built out a rent deferral tracking module that helped landlords and tenants document COVID-related agreements in a way that was compliant with the emergency rent relief programs the federal and provincial governments were rolling out. It was not glamorous. It was not the vision I had started with, but it kept us alive and it got us 1,200 users in 8 months. By 2021, I had a team of 4. By 2022, I had 11 employees, real revenue, just over $2.1 million AR and we had been named in 2 industry publications as one of the more interesting prop tech companies operating in the Canadian mid-market. I had also, somewhere in that period, stopped answering my father's calls as quickly as I used to. It wasn't intentional at first, I was just busy. And then I noticed that the calls that came most frequently were not calls to check in on me, they were calls about the company. How much were we making? Who had invested? Were we planning to raise a proper round? Did I know that Theo had a client who might be interested in a partnership? Theo, always Theo. The calls escalated in 2022. My father started referring to Halcyon as our company. Not your company. Our company. At first I let it go because I didn't want to fight. Then he mentioned it at Christmas dinner in front of my aunt and 2 cousins, and I corrected him, gently. And he looked at me with that particular look he had, like I was being difficult in a way that was embarrassing for everyone. And he said, well, I did put money in. $50,000 in a company now doing 7 figures in annual revenue, 3 years earlier with no documentation. I went home that night and called my lawyer. My lawyer, a woman named Opal who I had been working with since incorporation and who I trust completely, told me what I already knew but needed to hear from someone else. The $50,000 was documented only as a bank transfer. It had no attached agreement. Depending on how a dispute was framed, it could be argued as equity, as debt, as a gift, as anything. The ambiguity was real. The risk was real. I needed to address it. We drafted a document retroactively, a formal debt acknowledgement treating the $50,000 as a zero-interest loan with a 5-year repayment window beginning 2019. I sent it to my father and explained what it was and asked him to sign. He did not sign. He called me instead and told me the document was insulting, that he was an investor, that he deserved equity, that Theo had told him the company was worth, quote, easily 5 to 10 million, and that his 50,000 should be worth at least 5 or 6%. I told him as calmly as I could that he had put in $50,000 without any equity agreement, that I had built the company, that the value was created by my work and my team's work, and that a retroactive equity claim 3 years in was not how investment worked. He told me I was being ungrateful. I stopped calling him after that, and I started preparing. Opal and I had been talking to a few potential acquirers since late 2022. There was growing interest in the Canadian PropTech space from larger enterprise software companies, and Halcyon's specific niche, the mid-market landlord segment, which the big players had largely ignored, was genuinely attractive. By spring of 2023, we had 3 serious conversations happening in parallel. The one that mattered most was with a Vancouver-based enterprise software company called Meridian Pacific Group. They had a suite of commercial property tools, but nothing in the residential mid-market. Halcyon was exactly what they needed to close that gap. The lead on their side was their head of corporate development, a man I'll call Mr. Ashworth. Very measured, very precise. He'd been in enterprise software for 20 years. The preliminary offer that came through in May 2023 was $8.4 million for full acquisition, with a 2-year earnout clause tied to retention targets. I owned 80% of the company. You can do the math. I was 30 years old. I had one condition before I would proceed to the full due diligence phase. I wanted the initial negotiation meeting held in person in Toronto at a neutral venue. Not because I was being difficult, because I had a feeling about how the next few months would go, and I wanted to be sitting at a table when it happened. The meeting was scheduled for the 2nd week of June, a boardroom at a hotel downtown on Wellington Street. Boardroom Pacific would send Ashworth and 2 colleagues. My side would be me, Opal, and my CFO. My father found out about the meeting through Theo. I still don't know exactly how Theo knew. My best guess is that he had a connection at Boardroom Pacific through his real estate network. The commercial property world in Toronto is not large, and that someone mentioned Halcyon in passing. However it happened, my father called me 2 days before the meeting and told me he planned to attend. I told him that was not appropriate, that this was a business negotiation, that he had no formal role in the company, and that I would not be including him. He told me that he had put money into this company and that he had a right to be there. I did not argue. I hung up and called hotel security to let them know we might have an unwanted visitor, and then I made one other call that I will get to in a moment. The morning of the meeting, I wore a navy blazer I had bought specifically for occasions when I needed to feel like I had already won. I got to the hotel early, arranged the room, made sure the materials were in order. Ashworth and his team arrived at 9:30. Opal and my CFO were already seated. We had just started introductions when the door opened. My father walked in. Theo was one step behind him. My father was wearing a suit I recognized from Theo's convocation 10 years ago. He looked around the room with that expression he had, the one that said he belonged anywhere he decided to go. He pulled out a chair and sat down like he'd been expected. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then my father looked at Ashworth and said, "I'm her father. I'm one of the original investors in this company." Ashworth looked at me. I kept my expression completely neutral. My father kept going. He didn't wait to be invited. He started talking about Halcyon's early days, about how he had seeded the whole thing, about how his involvement had been foundational. He used the word foundational 3 times. He talked about the $50,000 like it was the entire origin story of the company. He talked about Theo's real estate expertise and how Theo might be a natural fit for a board seat in any post-acquisition structure. Ashworth and his colleagues had gone very still, not uncomfortable, just watching. Then my father said it. He looked at Ashworth and, gesturing at me, he said, "She's not as experienced as she presents herself. She's had guidance the whole way. She doesn't have the business background for a deal of this size, and I want to make sure you understand that before you go further." I watched Ashworth's assistant write something on her notepad. I had been waiting for this. Not for those words specifically, but for the moment when my father would go just far enough that the room would need to respond. I said quietly, "Can I show you something?" I opened the folder in front of me and slid a document across the table to Ashworth. He looked at it for a moment. His eyebrows moved slightly, which for him was equivalent to a sharp intake of breath. My father said, "What is that?" Ashworth said, not to my father but to me, "This is the CVCA recognition from last fall." My father looked at him blankly. Opal said, helpfully, "The Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, the Emerging Company Award." My father said nothing. I slid another document across. This one was a letter from the Ontario Centre of Innovation, from a program I had been a peer reviewer for over the past 2 years, reviewing grant applications from other early-stage tech companies. A position you had to be nominated for, a position that required demonstrated expertise. I said, "I also have the term sheet from our Series A conversation with BDC Capital in 2021, which we ultimately didn't close because we decided to pursue the acquisition path instead. It documents the due diligence they conducted on my background and the company's financial position. I can share that as well, if it would be useful." Ashworth looked at my father. Not in an angry way, not in a dramatic way. He just looked at him the way you might look at something you needed to make a decision about. He said, "Mister, I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced formally. What is your role with Halcyon Analytics?" My father said, "I'm an investor." Ashworth said, "Can you tell me the nature of your investment? Equity percentage, instrument type." My father looked at Theo. Theo looked at his hands. Opal cleared her throat softly and said, "There's no formal equity position associated with the 2019 funds. The company's cap table is on page 7 of the data room package we sent last week." Ashworth said, "So you're not a shareholder?" My father said, "That was never properly formalized." That's actually something we've been working to address. Ashworth said, I see. 2 words. That was all, but the temperature in the room had changed completely. My father tried to recover. He started talking about the importance of family involvement in founder-led companies, about continuity, about cultural fit. He said something about how Theo had connections in the commercial real estate sector that could add value in a post-acquisition integration. He was talking faster than he had been. His voice had a different quality now. I let him finish. Then I said, I'd like to address what was said earlier about my experience and my capability. I looked at Ashworth, not at my father. Halcyon went from 0 to $2.1 million ARR in 3 years through a global pandemic without external financing. We have an 87% client retention rate. Our net promoter score in last quarter's survey was 62. The product architecture was built on a stack that our technical advisors have described as unusually scalable for a company our size. I am the sole decision maker. I have been the sole decision maker since the day I incorporated. I'd like you to evaluate this acquisition on those facts. Ashworth nodded once. My father said, she's always been like this. She doesn't listen. She cuts people out. And then something happened that I had not planned and could not have scripted. Ashworth looked at my father, directly, and he said in the most even voice I have ever heard, I'm going to ask you to step out of this meeting. My father stared at him. Ashworth said, this is a confidential commercial negotiation. You've identified yourself as not holding any formal interest in the company. I need to ask you to leave. My father looked at me. I think he expected me to intervene, to soften it, to do the thing I had done my whole life, which was to smooth over his behavior to keep the peace. I said nothing. He stood up. Theo stood up. They walked to the door. Before he left, my father turned back and said, you'll regret this. Ashworth said pleasantly, thank you for stopping by. The door closed. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then my CFO, who had been silent for the entire preceding 20 minutes, said under her breath, holy. Ashworth allowed himself what might, in different lighting, have been a small smile. We continued the meeting. The acquisition closed in September of 2023. The due diligence process took longer than expected, it always does, but nothing my father had said in that boardroom had any effect on the outcome. Ashworth told Opal afterward in a side conversation that the intervention had actually made the team more confident in me because of the way I had handled it. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that founders who can stay composed under that kind of pressure tend to be the same founders who can manage a 2-year earnout without drama. I don't know what my father told people about what happened. Theo sent me a text 3 weeks after the meeting that said only, Dad is upset, you should call him. I did not respond. The $50,000. In the weeks before closing, Opal and I had a decision to make. We could let it remain unresolved. The transfer was so old and so undocumented that it would have been very difficult for my father to pursue a claim at that point, especially given that he had never signed the debt acknowledgement I had offered him in 2022. Or we could close it out. I chose to close it out. I had Opal draft a formal notice of debt repayment, treating the $50,000 as an unsecured loan with interest calculated at the Bank of Canada prime rate over the period from 2019 to 2023, which came to approximately $7,800. Total repayment $57,800. Total repayment $57,800. I sent it by registered mail to my father's house in Sudbury, along with a certified check. I included a cover letter that said, in its entirety, please find enclosed repayment in full of the funds transferred in May 2019, with interest at the applicable rate. This concludes any financial relationship between us. The enclosed documentation reflects this resolution. Please confirm receipt. He cashed the check. His lawyer sent a letter 2 weeks later claiming the funds did not represent full and fair compensation for his equity interest. Opal responded with a 4-page letter outlining the complete absence of any equity agreement, the multiple opportunities he had been given to formalize a different arrangement, and the fact that he had accepted the repayment without objection. We did not hear from his lawyer again. I think about my mother sometimes when I think about all of this. She would have been 61 this past March. I don't know if she would have understood what I built. Prop tech was not something she would have had a framework for, but I think she would have recognized the look on my father's face in that boardroom. She had seen it before in different rooms for different reasons. She always said, be the one who did the work, because eventually the work is the only thing nobody can argue with. I have my own place now, in a building near Christie Pitts. I own it, which still surprises me sometimes when I walk through the door. The earnout is on track. My team is still largely intact. The product is being integrated into Meridian Pacific's platform, and it's going better than projected. Theo called me in December, around the holidays. I picked up. He didn't apologize exactly, but he said something like, that whole thing got out of hand. I told him I agreed. We talked for about 12 minutes, mostly about our respective Christmases, and then we hung up. I don't know what that means for us going forward. I'm not thinking about it too hard. My father has not called. The certified check he cashed is framed, a photocopy of it, hanging in my home office, not out of bitterness, more as a reminder of a very specific kind of lesson I learned slowly and paid for in years. Never let the ambiguity be someone else's leverage. Everything else you can figure out. The photocopy of that check has been hanging in my home office for over a year now. Sometimes I walk past it without really seeing it. Other times I stop and look at it for a second longer than necessary, not because it makes me feel proud exactly, but because it reminds me of something I had to learn the hard way, that the choices you make quietly over years when nobody is watching are the ones that determine what happens in the room when everything is finally on the line. My father walked into that boardroom believing that confidence was the same thing as credibility. He had spent his whole life in environments where the loudest voice shaped the outcome, and I think he genuinely believed that showing up and asserting ownership, even ownership he had never documented, never formalized, never earned through anything except an early wire transfer, would be enough. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was a kind of blindness. He had never had to do the work of building anything from nothing, so he didn't understand what that work looked like from the outside or how clearly it shows to people who have done it themselves. Ashworth had built things. You could tell. Which is why the moment my father started talking, Ashworth went very quiet in a particular way, the way people go quiet when they are rapidly updating their assessment of a situation. What I keep coming back to is this. I could have handled that meeting differently. I could have been angrier or more defensive, or I could have tried to shut my father out before it got to the point it got to. But I think the reason things resolved the way they did is because I had spent 3 years making decisions I could defend. Every number in that data room was real. Every credential in that folder was earned. There was no gap between what I'd claimed to be and what I actually was. And when the moment came, that gap, or the absence of it, was the only thing that mattered. That's what I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story. Not a lesson, exactly. More of an observation about how things actually tend to work out over time. Integrity is not a soft concept. It's the most practical thing I know. It means that when someone tries to rewrite your story in a room full of people who matter, you don't have to argue. You just have to open a folder. The work speaks if you let it. Intelligence matters too, but not in the way I used to think. It's not about being the smartest person at the table. It's about understanding your situation clearly enough, early enough to prepare for what's coming. I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that my father would eventually try to claim something. I didn't know exactly when or how, but I had called Opal. I had made the other call. I had the folder ready. That kind of thinking, clear-eyed, unsentimental, a few steps ahead, is something you can practice. It gets easier. And the third thing, the one that doesn't get talked about enough, the willingness to keep going when it's genuinely hard, not dramatic hard. Just the ordinary, relentless hard of building something real over years, when there's no guarantee, when the heat might go out in February, when the roadmap doesn't survive contact with a global pandemic. That kind of endurance isn't glamorous. Nobody hands you an award for it, but it's what everything else is built on. My mother would have understood that last part, I think. She lived it every day. The check stays on the wall.